tonight. So if you want to turn there, we're working our way through the books of the Old Testament. There's a common twofold theme in each one of the minor prophets and major prophets. What are they? Pardon? Doom and gloom on the one side and salvation on the other side. All right? And of course it has two different groups of people in view. I'm going to take away your whatever you call those, your ice cream cones, if you don't pay attention, Caleb. Okay? Your freezies, yeah. You have to look up here and quit talking to your neighbors, okay? Pardon?
Give you a brain freeze when you eat from that.
Oh, that's what happens? Oh. So the book of Nahum is actually a sequel to the story of Jonah. Did you know that? Now, the way I remember it is like this. Jonah. Okay, so Jonah, last three letters in Jonah are the first three letters in Nahum, or Nahum, and Jonah comes first, 100 years before Nahum. All right. When we studied the book of Jonah, it's really a message of God's mercy, isn't it? And these two books are poles apart, right? The book of Jonah was in the early part of the 8th century, and or the 800s BC, and it was God was sending Jonah as a missionary to save these pagan people, and save them he did. The whole city got saved. All right, it was a tremendous revival. That's the miracle in the book of Jonah that you got to remember, not the fish. Okay, and so the book of Jonah stresses God's mercy and His saving grace upon the lost. However, 100 years later, almost exactly, this civilization, its time came due. And now the other facet of God's character on the opposite side, His justice and His holiness, were manifest. And because they were deserving of His judgment, as we all are, in one respect or another, then God pronounced judgment upon these people, and it was executed about 612 BC. I was telling Dean just for church tonight that providentially God provided me with a series of a small encyclopedia set entitled The Illustrated Family Encyclopedia of the Living Bible. My wife and I were traveling back, I think, to pick Stephanie up from school a couple of years ago in Saskatchewan, and we stopped at a mall, forget the name of the mall in southern Winnipeg, and we're just doing the old tourist thing, and they had these book stalls all through the mall out in the hallways, and one of these stalls had it was all reference works, encyclopedias, dictionaries, that kind of thing, maps, and I got this for $10. This set of encyclopedias, and this is absolutely filled with pictures of archaeological discoveries, maps, and everything else, photographs of biblical sites. It's the best thing I've ever. For $10, I got it, and there's a picture of Nineveh in it. This is the site of ancient Nineveh right here. I'm going to pass this around. I just mark it on the board there. Page 57 is the site of Nineveh. It's actually got a detail of the ancient city walls, and it covered no less than 2,000 acres enclosed. It was huge by ancient world standards. These people thought themselves impregnable, but there was a coalition of Medes, Persians, and Babylonians from the north and east that came against these people and destroyed them in 612 BC. And this is almost 110 years after they had taken the 10 northern tribes captive. And because they had judged or dared to attack Israel. Remember the ancient promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, those that curse you I will curse, those that bless you I will bless. Well, God then 100 years after the fact, brought his judgment on these people for, interestingly, being his agent, his elect agent in punishing the 10 northern tribes for their judgment or for their idolatry. And so Nineveh was destroyed by the Babylonians. The center of power shifted from Assyria, with its capital in Nineveh, to the west, which is almost directly north of Israel, and shifted east to your modern-day Iraq or to Babylon. We are actually familiar with because of the recent war over there that's been in the news, Mosul to the north, which is not too far from Turkey, the border of Iraq and Turkey. It's one of the northern strongholds that Saddam Hussein had. And you'll see that on the Tigris River, Mosul is on the southwest bank, and the ancient city of Nineveh is across the river from Mosul. Okay, and so anyway, we're familiar with that name. We also have in this book we have a reproduction of a chronicle by Sennacherib, who was the founding king of the Babylonian dynasty. No, it wasn't the Babylonian. It was not Sennacherib. This is the fall of. This is a Babylonian chronicle relating the fall of Nineveh. Okay, and this is really good extra biblical or non-scriptural corroboration of biblical events. There are also reliefs here, pictures of reliefs of the Assyrian charioteers and their method of attacking their enemies that are actually detailed in this book of Nahum. I'm going to pass this around. Please feel free to look at the pictures while we're studying tonight. So, Jonah was a prophet in the early part of the 8th century, about 750 BC, and he was a prophet that brought salvation to these people in Assyria. 100 years later, almost exactly, Nahum, the 12th prophet, prophesied God's judgment against these people. It was after... by the way, there is also a relief in there by the I think it's the Babylonian, no, it's by the Assyrians who had destroyed Thebes, which was the capital of Upper Egypt. Do you understand? People have no sense of geography. A relief is a two-dimensional carving on a wall or a column, all right, or whatever of some historical event. And so the Assyrians had been able to capture the Nile Delta, which is southern Egypt. Everybody know where Egypt is? How many don't know where Egypt is? Okay. Do you know where Africa is?
Stephen, maybe some people have maps in the back of the
Yeah, maybe that. If you have a map in the back of your Bible, turn there. Good idea. Thank you, Jean. We used to have our maps here. I don't know what happened to them. Pardon? What? So here is the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt is at the southeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And this part of Egypt is actually downriver. So it's lower Egypt, the lower kingdom of Egypt. Thebes is right here on the map on the Nile River, and this is in the mountainous part of Egypt, up high. So it's called Upper Egypt, even though it's south. Right? It's a little bit confusing. And Sennacherib's son was named Ashur-bani-pal, and he was the one that captured Thebes in 666 BC, and And the Assyrians controlled all of Egypt after 666 BC, and there is actually a relief that Ashurbanipal did to describe the fall of the fortified city of Thebes in Egypt, and it shows the city princes being taken captive and so forth. So they've actually discovered that piece of archaeological evidence for that event. That's interesting because that's mentioned in this book. This book is written against the Assyrians. God says, who do you think you people are, in effect? You think you're going to outlast my judgment? How about Thebes? Right? It fell. Okay? And it was those people, it was these very people that captured Thebes in Egypt. Let's read it in Habakkuk chapter 3, Nahum chapter 3, verse 8. At the end of the book he says, are you better than populous Noaman that was situated among the rivers? In the King James it says, are you better than populous Thebes that was situated among the rivers that had the waters round about it, whose rampart was the sea and her wall was from the sea? Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was unlimited. Put and Lubim were her helpers, yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets, and they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. There's a two-dimensional relief of that event. Thebes is situated in the middle of the Nile River. The great Nile River flows on both sides of the island. It was fortified with walls right to the water's edge, and yet this great ancient city was destroyed by the Assyrians themselves in 66 BC. They were very familiar with this. This was a great deal in their history. They were proud of their military accomplishments against the Egyptians, and God says, do you think you're better than your own victims? You too will be a victim of my judgment. All right, so that's the message of this book. Let's go to the front of the book, chapter 1, and let's read the threefold development of God's judgment on the Assyrians with the capital in Nineveh. Chapter 1 is basically the proposition, I'm going to destroy you, and my people that you have attacked are going to rejoice. That's the proposition in the first chapter of the book. The second chapter in Nahum describes in detail the fall, the attack on the city of Nineveh and its destruction. And chapter 3 describes the reasons why God destroyed Nineveh. Let's read it. Chapter 1, God's proposition, his doom and gloom pronounced upon the Assyrians. The burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. God is jealous, and the Lord avenges. The Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind, and in the storm, and the clouds of the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry, dries up all the rivers. Bashan languisheth, and Carmel and the flower of Lebanon languishes. Bashan was to the northeast of Israel. It was probably the most luxurious cropland in the country, just on the east side of the Jordan. Carmel was on the Mediterranean. Because it's a high mountain on the edge of the sea, the rains would constantly fall on the western slope, and it was one of the most productive grape-growing areas in the country. And Lebanon to the north was a great forest in biblical times, the cedars of Lebanon. All right, that's where the timbers were brought. They were purchased by the Jews from the Lebanese to build Solomon's temple and the great palaces. Right? And so to illustrate the severity of God's judgment, he says, look at all these lush places where the best of everything grows, and I have the power to dry them to nothing. The mountains quake before him, God, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence. Yea, the world and all that dwell in it. Who can stand before his indignation, and who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who trust in him. This is a quick flip describing God's goodness to believers on the other side. But with an overrunning flood, he will make an utter end of the place, and darkness shall pursue his enemies. In my Bible, I've underlined with red every statement of divine judgment on the Assyrians in this book of Nahum. So in verse 6, it refers to God's indignation, God's anger, his fury. In verse 8, God says, I will make an utter end of the place. Verse 9, what do you imagine against the Lord? He will make an utter end. Affliction shall not rise up the second time. One fell swoop. And that's exactly what happened in the Babylonian, Mede, and Persian alliance against the Assyrians, specifically Nineveh. That one document that's mentioned there describes how that the Babylonian allies went up and in one fell swoop destroyed the city and killed every soldier in the army. Right? It was a complete rout. And it was prophesied here. In verse 9, for while they are entangled together like thorns, and while they be drunk like drunkards, they shall be devoured like stubble fully dry. There is one come out of thee that imagineth evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. This may be a reference to the founder of the Assyrian Empire, Sennacherib, or one of the men in the dynasty, Ashurbanipal, or I can't pronounce all the names, but there was a family anyway. Thus saith the Lord, though they be quiet and likewise many, yet thus shall they be cut down when he shall pass through. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. For now will I break his yoke from off thee, and will burst thy bonds in sunder. And the Lord has given a commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown. Out of the house of thy gods will I cut off the carved image and the melted image. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. And then the last verse of this chapter switches to the other side and describes the effect of God's judgment on Israel's enemies, on Israel, or on Judah in particular. God says, behold, on the mountains, the feet of him that brings good tidings, that publishes peace. O Judah, keep thy solemn feasts, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee. He is utterly cut off. There's a note in my footnotes at verse 12, a strange phrase. Thus saith the Lord, though they be quiet and likewise many. Though they be quiet and likewise many doesn't make a lot of sense. And the editors of my Bible say that although this is a literal translation of the Hebrew, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Actually, the Hebrew, they write, here represents a transliteration of a long-forgotten Assyrian legal formula. Excavation in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, buried since 612 BC, has brought to light thousands of ancient Assyrian tablets, dozens of which contain these very words. Though they be quiet and likewise many. So this was a well-known legal phrase in the Assyrian language that meant joint and several responsibility for carrying out any obligation. So the sense of this, God takes their own legal jargon and he turns it around and he applies it to the way he's going to judge them. And he says, even though you people all join together, joint and severally, to use legal jargon, to resist me, I will just roll right over you like a tank. Okay? Right? Interesting, isn't it? So in Hebrew, this is a Hebrew transliteration of an actual Assyrian legal document or legal jargon. And I think it's kind of like a play on words. God is it's interesting how God will take people's own language, and apply it to his own ways and means. So, chapter 1, God says, I have it in for you. I don't know how many times, probably a dozen times, he says, I'm going to have my way. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind, and he's going to have his way with Nineveh. Chapter 2, we have the details. How is it going to happen? He that dashes in pieces is come up before thy face. Keep the fortress, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily. For the Lord has turned away the excellency of Jacob, as the excellency of Israel, for the emptiers have emptied them out and marred thy vine branches. The shield of his mighty men are made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariot shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the fir trees shall be terribly shaken. The chariots shall rage in the streets, they shall jostle one another in the broad ways, they shall seem like torches, they shall run like the lightnings. He shall recount his nobles, they shall stumble in their walk, they shall make haste to the wall, the defense shall be prepared, the gates of the river shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. And it is decreed, she shall be led away captive, she shall be brought up, and her maids shall lead her as with the voice of doves, beating upon their breasts. But Nineveh is as old like a pool of water, yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, but none shall look back. Take the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is no end of the store, and glory out of all the pleasant furniture. She is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. Where is the dwelling of the lions, and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion, even the old lion, walked, and the lions whelped, and none made them afraid? The lion did tear in pieces enough for his whelps, and strangled for his lionesses, and filled his holes with prey, and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I will cut off thy prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messengers shall no more be heard. There are a number of interesting references here to the way the Assyrians themselves waged war. The Assyrians were well known in ancient times for being the most vicious of the Near East nations. The reason Jonah was afraid to go to Nineveh is because these people from antiquity were known to be absolutely merciless. They would take their victims in chains or with hooks in their noses, and they took them from all over the world where they conquered them back to Nineveh, their capital, and then in orgies of killing, they would kill these people. The streets would run red with their blood. They would skin their victims alive, take the skin and wrap the skins of their victims and sew it around the pillars of their public buildings. These people were, wicked, merciless. My wife could hardly watch the movie last night. She didn't watch much. We rented what's its name of it?
Gladiator.
The Gladiator, which is a story of set in the days of the Romans, and one of the Roman Caesars, re-implemented the gladiator warfare for the crowds and gave the people bread to gain popularity. And it was a very gory time of life, very, very. They just traded in human flesh for the sport of watching people die. And it was something to cheer about when people killed people in the Colosseum in Rome. And partway through that movie, I was noticing, just as I was reading this, there's a point in that movie where these gladiators are being sent out by their owner, who owned them, body, soul, and spirit, and they had to run underneath a canopy of cloths that were soaked in blood. And so when they came onto this is down in Africa before they actually went to the Colosseum in Rome, by the time they got out into the arena, they were already drenched in blood all over the place, and this was just to whet the appetite of the crowds. And red was the color of the gods, right? The red for sacrifice. And there's a reference to it here. Where is it? Verse 3, the shield of his mighty men is made red, and the valiant men are in scarlet. The chariot shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the fir tree shall be terribly shaken. So there's just an allusion here to the fact that, these people did practice something quite similar to the Romans in later times. Red was popular with the gods, the pagan gods, color of blood. Another thing to just note in passing in this chapter is that there is a reference to the chariots running around, screeching around the city. Just going like crazy. And there's actually relief pictures taken off of the walls of ancient Nineveh, that they were proud of their mobile forces. This is like the ancient blitzkrieg, that not all ancient peoples possessed chariots. The Egyptians possessed chariots. They chased the Jews, when they left Egypt. And the Assyrians possessed chariots. The Jews rarely possessed chariots. It was only during the days of Solomon and David and Solomon, and perhaps shortly thereafter, that the Jews were strong enough to control the smelting process, that they could make their own weaponry and chariotry industries. Right? And so it was only these great and powerful nations that had large armies, that had forces that, so well equipped to have chariots. And these were very vicious things, just as they showed in that movie we watched last night on the Gladiator. These chariots weren't just vehicles that carried soldiers to war, but they had knives on the axles that would stick out, and they just had to drive through the enemy and just cut them to shreds. And the Jews were terrified of the Philistines, who possessed chariots back in the days of Joshua, right? Because these were just horrendous weapons of war. And so God, in his pronouncement of judgment upon the Assyrians, describes the fact that their chariots are going to do them absolutely no good. I read in one book on archaeology that the ancient walls of Nineveh were so broad that 7 teams of horses, 7 double or triple teams of horses, could run around the tops of the walls of the city of Nineveh side by side, pulling chariots. That's how big they were. Like probably as wide as this room, or wider. Probably wider than this room in places. 7 teams of horses could run around the wall. They could just move their soldiers from point A to point B along their wall in their defense, with no trouble whatsoever. God says, isn't going to do you any good. I pronounce judgment. I say you're going to fall. Your enemies are going to come through and they're going to rip your city to shred, and they're going to kill all your people. And so God used, the things that they were proudest about to be useless in their own defense. So why did God pronounce judgment, and why did he say this great city and civilization was going to fall? Look at chapter 3. Woe to the bloody city! It is full of lies and robbery. The prey departs not. The noise of a whip, and the noise of the rattling of the wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the bounding chariots. The horseman lifts up both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there is a multitude of slain, and a great number of carcasses, and there is no end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses. So one of the reasons God judged these people is because of the horrendous human destruction and slaughter that these people were responsible for. Let me ask you a question. Do you think North America is going to survive? Do you think North America, Canada, the United States, do you think the Western world is going to escape God's judgment? More babies have been killed through abortion in the last 30 years in these two countries combined than soldiers have been killed in all the wars combined. Millions and millions and millions of babies have been killed as part of the sexual revolution in this country. And it continues. And there doesn't seem to be much social conscience about it, although there was a life chain today in Sault Ste. Marie. There's silent protest. Christians do stand up. Catholics do stand up. Other people stand up against it, but it doesn't seem to really have much of an impact, does it? It's like a juggernaut that's hard to stop. Well, we know what God's character is like. God created men, and there is value to every human soul. And one of the reasons why capital punishment is supposed to be practiced against people who kill other people is because every man is made in God's image. And so to kill another human is really a slight on God's character and God's own person, because this is taking the life principle from somebody that God gave. And that's described in Genesis chapter 9 and reiterated in James chapter 3. That's why you're not supposed to curse another human being, because that person is made in God's image. Right? And so one of the reasons God's judgment came upon the Assyrians is simply because they were so wicked, so horrendously violent as a nation. He describes it. Verse 5. Verse 4. Because of the multitude of the harlotries of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcrafts, that selleth nations through her harlotries and families through her witchcrafts, behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will uncover thy skirts from thy face. I will show the nations thy nakedness, and the kingdoms thy shame. And I will cast abominable filth upon thee, and make thee vile, and will set thee as a gazing stock. And it shall come to pass that all they that look upon thee shall flee from thee, and say, Nineveh is laid waste, and who will bemoan her? Where shall I seek comforters for thee? Now this was probably true both in a literal and a metaphorical sense. These people literally practiced ritual sex religions, where they had female and male prostitutes as part of their religious practices. But just as sinful as that is the fact that these people practice idolatry, simple and plain. They practice witchcraft and occultism, and that's the worship of Satan. Okay? Occult is Satanism in its varying forms. And so God pronounced judgment on these people because they were violent and wicked and had little regard for human life. And He judged them because of their immorality and their idolatry. That's why. Now, if God judged Nineveh for these reasons, this country and most of the other nations of the world, are not going to escape God's judgment, because He's already shown in history what He feels about these things. He's already laid it out on paper, His reasons for bringing judgment in the past. And that's why we read in Isaiah and Jeremiah where it says that God has a controversy with the nations. Why do you think human history is going to essentially close? Remember the vision of Daniel? After the kingdoms have run their course, a stone comes out of heaven, smashes the foot, right? That makes the last of the human kingdoms falter, right? And that stone becomes a great kingdom that lasts for 1,000 years. The book of Revelation describes it, in other terms. And, Christ's kingdom is going to supplant all human kingdoms up to this point. And God has a controversy with all the nations of the world, because all the nations of the world run on demonic, idolatrous principles with low regard for human life. Politics is a dirty business. There's no integrity, no justice to speak of, right? It's greed, power, and whatever else. And so that's the way the nations of the world, whether they be so-called democracies, or whether they be dictatorships, or whether they be oligarchies or republics, or whatever they might be, run by family clans, it's all corrupt. From God's perspective, it's all corrupt. And so Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, henceforth we as Christians look for a kingdom in which dwells righteousness. And the book of Revelation says we shall reign. Those that participate in the first resurrection will reign with Christ for 1,000 years. We're going to actually see it, I believe. I really believe that, so shall we ever be with the Lord, is the promise, when Jesus returns for his own. It says, so shall we ever be with the Lord. And if there's a rapture and we're taken up in the rapture, and if Jesus sets up His kingdom on earth, where do you think we're going to be? I believe we're going to be with Him. I think we're going to see it with our own eyes. We're going to see the fulfillment of our heart's longing. We're going to see justice prevail. And the book of Nahum is just one more of those ancient prophecies that predicts that that at intervals throughout ancient history, God has sovereignly intervened, to pronounce it, to set a track record and a precedent to show us that He really means business. This is what He thinks about life. This is what He thinks about politics. This is what He thinks about injustice and idolatry. And, He's on record. And He keeps His promises. Right? This book is placed between 666, when the Assyrians themselves destroyed the Egyptian city of Thebes and became proud of that, and 612 when they were destroyed by a Babylonian Media-Persian alliance. So somewhere in that intervening space of 50-some years, is it? 666 minus 12 is 54 years. Somewhere in that 54 years, Nahum received his message pronouncing judgment on these people, because in 612, that's when the axe fell on Nineveh. History records that event. And there's a copy of a document right there that's been discovered, written by the Babylonians looking back on the fall of Nineveh, that corroborates this prophecy. Are you better than populous Thebes, that was situated among the rivers, that had the waters round about, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea? Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was unlimited. Put, which is a reference to some place in Africa, and Lubim, likewise, were thy helpers. Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. Thou also shalt be drunk. Thou shalt be hidden. Thou also shalt seek strength because of the enemy. All thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they shall even fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, thy people in the midst of thee are women. The gates of thy land shall be set wide open upon thine enemies. The fire shall devour thy bars. Draw thee waters for the siege. Fortify thy strongholds. Go into clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. There shall the fire devour thee. The sword shall cut thee off. It shall eat thee up like the cankerworm. Make thyself many like the cankerworm. Make thyself many like the locusts. Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. The cankerworm spoileth and flieth away. Thy princes are like the locusts, and thy captains like the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day. But when the sun arises, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people are scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathers them. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that hear the report of thee shall clap the hands over thee, for upon whom has not thy wickedness passed continually? Nobody mourned the fall of Assyria. Nobody. Except perhaps the Assyrians themselves. Eh? Assyria, and the capital was Nineveh. Yeah, nobody mourned the passing of this great empire. So there's some interesting lessons. God is still a God who avenges sin. God is still a holy and righteous God who is angry over sin. God is still an awesome avenging power. God is still a God who is against sinners as well as sin. God is consistent in his judgment. And God doesn't forget. He just doesn't forget. He's keeping records. He has an account. Right? And if there's a sobering book in the Bible, it's this one. You know, reading this book is sort of like a short version of reading the book of, say, Revelation. Right? With all the great tribulations and the cosmic divine judgments that are brought upon the world. Any questions? Comments?
You know what happened to Nahum?
No. We don't know much about him except the name of his name isn't that different from Nehemiah. It has the same roots in it. We know the name of his city, but that's it.
He was in the land of Israel, was it?
Elkoshite.
How did they get the message? I think it was down in Israel. He didn't even take it up there.
I don't know if they needed to receive the message.
He didn't write it to them.
I think that I just don't know the answer to that question. You know, there's probably twofold audience. One is the Ninevites themselves, and other is Judah, right? And I think that he probably this is after the Assyrian invasion, right? This is after 712 or 722, when the 10 northern tribes have already been taken captive, and so the only Jewish remnant living in the land is Judah. So it's likely that he was from Judah. Likely, well, there's two two verses in the book that talk about good news on the mountains for those in Judah. So this is really a message of encouragement to God's people that He is going to finger their enemies and deal with them. Right? All right, you've been patient. Thank you very much. God bless you. Have a good week.